Welcome back now into the second session of BI 300, Biblical Economics. This is going to be lecture 4.2. And I want to draw your attention as we continue what we just finished discussing in the first session. Now, we ended with this issue about the tithe. And I want to draw your attention now to the book of Deuteronomy. Turn your Bibles to the book of Deuteronomy now. And I want to say this statement to you. Since Israel was a theocracy, the Levites, especially in the days before the monarchy, constituted Israel's government. So the tithe was therefore a form of taxation. That you need to understand. Before the monarchy, this is before King Saul comes along, before King David comes along. Do you understand what I'm saying? Israel was a theocracy. It was run by the Levites. Now I want to draw your attention to the second tithe. This is for the festivals, the second tithe. So let's turn our Bibles down, and we're going to go into the book of Deuteronomy, all right? So I'm going to erase this. I want to keep this here because I want you to see this with me. And we're going to go to Deuteronomy. Chapter 12. And let's go through verses 1 through 19. And we come to the second tithe. And that was for the festivals. Now, Israel had various festivals. These were holy festivals. Okay? And the law of the land was that all Israelites had to give another tithe. This was a separate tithe just to support the festivals. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment with me, because in many, many countries that I travel to today, and I want to be constantly drawing your attention from the there and then, the Old Testament, to the here and now. From the there and then to the here and now. You have to have the ability to jump back and forth. So in the then and there, all Israelites were required to give another tithe. So you can see that there are multiple tithes in the Bible. It's not just one tithe. There are multiple tithes. But in the here and now, we love to reduce everything to 10%. How convenient. And even when we reduce it down to 10%, we still rob God. We have absolutely no shame. Now, I started to say this to you. As I travel around the world, and I'm absolutely amazed. You go to do Bible conferences, you go to do pastor trainingship, leadership training, and so forth, and what the host will always ask you to do, for those of us who come from here, from the West, and I've seen this in Latin America, I've seen this in Africa, I've seen this in Asia, okay? And they will ask us to do the following. We need you to pay for all of the transportation costs for all the pastors who are going to come and be trained. We need you to pay for their housing. We need you to pay for their food and transportation while they're here. And then we need you to pay for their transportation to go back home. I said, whoa, wait a minute. Hey, time out. You're asking me to pay them to get trained. Have you lost your mind? Because that is what missions has done for so long. So it is quite convenient to invite you to eat with your pocketbook. They have no investment in it, none whatsoever. So they'll come, they go to sleep, they don't invest anything in it. And what is freely given, rarely is it ever appreciated because you've invested nothing in it. Now think about the festivals. We're about to get into them. The high holy days, all of the festivals that was required in Israel. All members of Israel were required to pay this tithe in advance, so that all of the preparations will be done in advance for the high holy days and the festivals, the various festivals that they were going to have. The temple didn't pay for this. The Levites did not pay for this. The monarchy didn't pay for this. If you put it in terms today, the church doesn't pay for this. You pay for this. So let's open our Bibles to Deuteronomy. Let's go to chapter 12. So in addition, the Israelites had to pay a second tithe to fund the religious festivals. This was not optional. This was obligatory. So we go to Deuteronomy. And let's go to chapter 12. And I'm going to start down there in verse 1 so we can put it in its proper context. Read with me. These are the statutes and the judgments which you shall carefully observe in the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you to possess as long as you live on this earth. You shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispose serve their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. He says, you shall tear down their altars and smash their sacred pillars and burn their asherim with fire, and you shall cut down the engraved images of their gods and obliterate their name from that place. You shall not act like this toward the Lord your God. Look what he says. You shall not act like this toward the Lord your God. But you shall seek the Lord at the place which the Lord your God will choose from all your tribes to establish his name there for his dwelling. And there you shall come. There you shall bring your burnt offerings. You shall bring your sacrifices, your tithes, the contribution of your hand, your votive offerings, your freewill offerings, and the firstborn of your herd and of your flock. There also you and your household shall eat before the Lord your God and rejoice in all your undertakings in which the Lord your God has blessed you. You shall not do all that we do. Look at it. And look at verse 8. You shall not do at all what we are doing here today, every man doing whatever is right in his own eyes. That's not how you're going to conduct yourselves. For you have not as yet come to the resting place and the inheritance which the Lord your God has given you. When you cross the Jordan and live in the land which the Lord your God has given you to inherit, and he gives you rest from all of your enemies around you, so that you live in security. Then it shall come about that the place in which the Lord your God will choose for his name to dwell, there you shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, and the contribution of your hand, all of your choice votive offerings which you shall vow to the Lord. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your sons and your daughters and your male and your female servants and the Levite who is within your gates, since he has no portion or inheritance with you. Be careful that you do not offer your burnt offerings in every cultic place you see, but in the place which the Lord chooses in one of your tribes, there you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I command you. Then he says, be careful, but in the place. He says, however, verse 15, however, you may slaughter and eat meat within any of your gates, whatever you desire, according to the blessing of the Lord your God, which he has given you. The unclean and the clean may eat of it, as of the gazelle and of the deer. Only you shall not eat the blood. You are to pour it out on the ground like water. You are not allowed to eat within your gates, and the tithe of your grain, or the new wine, or the oil, or the firstborn of your herd or the flock, and any of your votive offerings which you vow, or your freewill offerings, or the contribution of your hand. Can you see that very clearly here? But you shall eat them before the Lord your God in the place which the Lord your God will choose. You and your son and your daughter and your male and your female servants and the Levite who is within your gates, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God in all your understanding. Be careful that you do not forsake the Levite as long as you live in your land. Now, let's look at this. So you can see from the reading of the word here. Now, they had a number of festivals. But under each one of these festivals, there were a number of offering and tithes that was required to be given. So look at this with me. Go back to verses, let's see. Let's look at this together. Look at verse 10. And then we're going to look at verse 17 and 18 together. Look at verse 10. When you cross the Jordan and live in the land which your Lord your God has given you to inherit, and he gives you rest from all the enemies, from all your enemies around you, so that you live in security. Now look at verse 11 very carefully. Then it shall come about that the place in which the Lord your God will choose for his name to dwell, there you shall bring all that I command you. Number 1, your burnt offerings. 2, your sacrifices. 3, your tithes. 4, the contribution of your hand. Right? And 5, all your choice votive offerings which you will vow to the Lord. So, let's look at this together. See, if you're going to live by the tithe, you have to be willing to live by the tithe. So this second offering now, depending on how many, now there's a lot of discussion how many festivals they existed. Okay, let's just deal with one festival. Okay, and under that one festival, and we look at let's look at verse 11. So here we have if we look at just one festival, okay, here's what was required for them to bring. They had to bring a burnt offering. Right? They had to bring sacrifices. They had to bring their tithes. And I looked this up in the Hebrew. It's multiple, plural tithes. Right? So if you had, for your grain offerings, there was a tithe. For your vineyards, there was a tithe. For your wine vats, there was a tithe. For your animals, right? There was a tithe. So you can see that it is plural. Right? And then we can see here in verse, and then he says, and the contributions. Then you had to decide what kind of contribution in addition you were going to give, right? We can see that there. And then your choice votive, okay, offerings. Right? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 minimum. You can see that. Now, even on the number 3, you would have had let's see, grain offerings, right? You would have had you would have had grain offerings. You would have had from your wine vats, right? You would have had from your vineyards. You would have had from your flocks, right? So look at this very carefully. You need to understand what you're talking about. So look at all of these additional tithes and offerings that was required. But none of this this is not voluntary. So, under the second tithe, which is the festivals, right? So if you have 1 festival, 2 festivals, 3 festivals, now let's go from the then and there to the here and now. To the here and now. So in the here now we have, let's say we have Easter, right? We have Christmas, right? We have Palm Sunday. We have Holy Week. Are you following me? You see what I'm talking about? So if you follow the same pattern, right? And so we have burnt offerings that are being brought in. We have sacrifices that are being brought in. Tithes that are being brought in. Various tithes. We have contributions that are being given. And we have choice votive offering because people are always vowing something to God. Lord, if you bless me, I'm going to do this. Okay? So so you have all of these multiple tithes and offerings that are coming in under the tithe heading. So you can begin to see this very clearly with me. If you're going to live by the tithe, then go ahead and live by the tithe. If you're going to live by the tithe, then you must be willing to die by the tithe. The problem is that the church today wants the luxury of reducing all of this down to one single tithe that's 10%, and even then they cheat God. So you need to be very careful with this. Now look at verse 17. Look at this. This continues. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 17. He says, now, you are not allowed to eat within your gates the tithe of your grain. You see that? Or the new wine. Okay? You see that? Or oil. You see that? So you even here you have oil. Okay? So there was wine, there was oil. Okay? You had your vineyards, you had your grapes. You had to bring a tithe of that. Right? He says, or the firstborn of your herd. You can see that. Let's mark it out here in my scriptures. Or your flock, or any of your votive offerings, right? So you have votive offerings, which you vow you shall free, and your free will offerings. Now, your free will offerings right here are these contributions. In addition to, there was always something coming. There was always a greater need in the temple itself. There was a greater need in the kingdom of Israel. There was other things that had to be done. So you have free will offerings and the contribution of your hand. This is just absolutely incredible. There is no end to this. Are there questions? Now. So now let me take you now to the third. Can you see this? So now we have the third tithe, which is to the poor. The third tithe is to the poor. Now I'm going to flip this over because this one gets a little more complicated. Now we have the third tithe, which is to the poor. Open your Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 14. Turn your pages. So let's go there. Chapter 14. And let's pick this up. Chapter 14. Verse 28 and 29. Verse 28 and 29. Let's pick this up here. Okay. Now there was a third tithe that was required of all of Israel. Again, this was not optional. Let's read the text. In this third tithe, at the end of every third year, you shall bring out all the tithe of your produce in that year, and shall deposit it in your town. The Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance among you, and the alien, the orphan, and the widow who are in your town, shall come and eat and be satisfied, in order that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hand, which you do. Now, we look at this very, very carefully here, okay? So in year 3, because that's what he says at the end of every third year, in verse 28. In year 3 and year 6 of the 7-year sabbatical cycle, there was a 7-year sabbatical cycle, okay? Rather than taking this tithe to the central sanctuary, it was instead stored up within the individual cities in the land. And this tithe was used to feed the Levites, the orphans, and the widows, and the strangers, and all the foreigners, right, who lived within the Israelites. So now, You remember that in Malachi, in chapter 3, verse 10. Remember that? And he says, in Malachi, just jump over there quickly with me. In Malachi chapter 3, verse 10, right? Because this is what he says there. In Malachi chapter 3, verse 10, right? Let's go back over there. I want you to see this with me. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse so that there may be food in my house, and test me now in this, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out from you a blessing until it overflows. Now, I'm going to make a note of this because I really need you to see, kind of connect the dots. So we get to Malachi chapter 3, verse 10. Now, I want you to remember what we discussed. I don't know how many classes ago. In Genesis chapter 41, if you remember this, right? And Genesis chapter 47, which is with Joseph. Now, remember that the storehouse was created in Egypt under the direction and leadership of Joseph. So these were grain houses that were run by the government to feed everybody during the famine. So the storehouse was never the church. The storehouse is literally a storehouse for food. That was in Egypt. The idea now, when the slaves of Israel were set slaves, and there were slaves in Egypt, they bring the idea, the concept over into Israel. So every city or village would have a storehouse, right? And that's where they would bring everything in there. Right? So at the end of the third year, okay, you would take a tithe of all of your produce, everything, would be brought into this storehouse so that a number of different people can eat. You see this very, very, very clearly there, okay? So look at it very carefully with me, okay? He says this in verse 29. So everything would come into this storehouse. And this is going to be at the end of the third year. You would bring this tithe. Now, what was the purpose of the tithe? It was for the poor. Now, notice that what it includes there. So they would come. There was no, you see, they didn't believe that you would have people homeless in the streets without food. So they were allowed to come and get as much as they needed to survive for the year. So watch this. So under here you have here, the Levites are included here because they have no inheritance. They have to work in the temple, in the ministry. So you have to feed them, right? You see this here, right? And then you see the foreigners, which is what they call the aliens, right? This is that's the word that's used here specifically here in Deuteronomy, right? He says here, and these will be the foreigners, right? So then we see here foreigners. This would include the orphans. Okay? This would include the widows. And they would come. Now, this doesn't stop there. So you can already see out of the three major tithes, on each tithe, okay, you have multiple plurality. You had these multiple tithes. We have the same situation here. Now, this is where we go from a tithe, okay, of 10%, you remember? We had 20%, right? And this is going all the way up to 25%. You can see these multiple tithes. Let me show you this. So thus, I want you to understand that thus required giving or taxation during the Mosaic era amounted to about 23rd and a third percent, and perhaps as much as 25%, when various other required offerings are taken into account. And I want you to keep that in mind. That's the range. But you and I, we love the idea that it's 10%, and even then, we rob God of the 10%. So turn your Bibles now to Leviticus. Now, let's pick this up here. I want you to see this. Leviticus. And let's do it, chapter 19. Verses 9 and 10. Leviticus chapter 19. We're still under this third tithe. Now, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very corners of your field, nor shall you gather to the gleanings of your harvest. Nor shall you glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the needy and for the stranger. I am the Lord your God. Watch this. So, let's say you have a piece of land. Okay? Now, it's an agrarian economy, right? It's all about agriculture, right? You're raising cattle, you have flocks, you have goats, you have sheep, right? You have camels, you have donkeys, right? And then all of it is all about raising food, right? You have grapes, you have wine vats, right? You have oil, right? You can see that, and then you actually have wine itself. That was a separate operation. So I want you to see this. So now, in this situation, look at what it says. This is a piece of land. He says, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very corners of your field, or nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. So let's say this is your land, right? And now you have fields, right? You have various crops that you're growing. Now, the four corners, the outer part, this here, this part right here, let's do it this way. This part right here. You could not harvest it. You would have an opening on all four sides, and you would come in and you would harvest everything on the inside. All the grain, all the oil, all the vats, all of the grapes, everything that fell, everything that was, and everything that grew here in this outer section, you could not touch by law. This was your tithe. And then on that third year, any foreigner walking through your land, they didn't have Amtrak then, they didn't have buses then, they didn't have, the railroad didn't exist, the airplanes didn't exist, okay? So everybody had to walk across from one land to another. So the foreigner can come in, the Levites can come in, the poor and the orphans and the widows. And by law, you cannot run them off your land. They all understood they can only glean all the food on the outside of every single piece of land in Israel as they went from one side to the other. Do you see that? That was required by law. This is under that third tithe. This is in addition to all those other tithes that we've already talked about under the third tithe. This is in addition to what we talked about in Deuteronomy chapter 14. You need to understand how this worked. This is how God met the needs of everybody in Israel, His chosen people. Now, that's how it functioned in the then and there. And if that is true, and you want to now bring it to the here and now, this is what you have to live by. But what happens is the church, you stop giving because you believe you are supposed to be the recipients of God's blessings. No, you're supposed to be the instruments of God's blessings.